Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. We're going to spend some time today in the first hour talking about foreign policy, and in particular, going to look at Sergeant Bergdahl, but we're going to get into some other issues as well and giving you a chance to join the conversation. Second hour today, we're going to get into the area of reproductive technology. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. I'll explain exactly what we'll be covering there, but I want to bring to the microphone Frank Gaffney, founder, a graduate of Georgetown University, and also holds a Master of Arts degree in International Studies from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. Frank Gaffney, always great to have you with us.
The pleasure is mine. Jeremy, thank you very much for having me.
Well, I guess we have to start with Sergeant Bergdahl, and I would love to get maybe some of your background. A lot of people have asked, is this the going rate, 5 Taliban killers for 1 American? We're now hearing from Ken Timmerman and others that it was a lot more than just those 5 Taliban individuals in Guantanamo, but what do you know, and how should we think about this trade that has been in the news for the last week or so?
Well, I think Ken is almost certainly right that there was even more money and perhaps other concessions made along the trail here. It would be bad enough if there were just 5 top global jihadists turned loose as a result of this transaction, but I'm afraid that's probably only part of the deal. Whether it's the going rate or not, Kerby, I guess remains to be seen. There's a report that I saw most recently in the New York Post yesterday by my friend Paul Sperry, who says that the so-called, what do they call it? It's a review commission of the a board at Guantanamo that has been established to assess the prudence, I guess you'd say, the opportunity for releasing the 140 people who are still there. And according to Paul's report, 70 of those worst of the worst, as they've been called, hardened terrorists will be released this summer for nothing.
Wow.
In exchange. So that would be, I guess, the new going rate. And I think what both of these have in common, Kerby, is the public safety is being put at risk by this president. And it won't be, I think, just, our troops overseas that are in the crosshairs. It will probably be people here at home as well.
There are 2 issues. Let's, on the one hand, say that certainly we appreciate the desire for any president at any time to make sure that we leave no man or woman on the battlefield. So, that's the positive. But the negatives, as you just alluded to, are huge. And the question that has been in the back of the minds of a number of individuals, surfaced even by some of our callers, as to whether or not this begins the closing down of Guantanamo, and the numbers that you've been talking about over the summer of what could indeed happen is that this might be the final realization of a promise that was given by candidate Obama to close down Guantanamo.
Yeah. And, I was talking with a colleague of mine, Andy McCarthy, today. Andy has written a very powerful new book, which I commend to you and your listeners, called Faithless Execution, making the political case for Obama's impeachment. And one of the things that he described in all of this is a fundamental dereliction of duty that is resulting in this change of circumstances. But as you say, the president has been obliged to his own view to close Gitmo. He staffed his administration with a host of people who were what has been called the Gitmo bar lawyers, who were trying to spring their clients, the detainees. And these guys have been hard at it ever since they got into office. They've been stymied again and again and again by bipartisan majorities in the Congress. But as Andy's described in his new book, the lawlessness of this president is going to be evident, I think, in his headlong rush to move these people out, no matter what, even the peril that it might put Americans at.
And we will have Andrew McCarthy on to talk about that book. It's one of the ones kind of in the pipeline. But since we have you,
I commend him to you.
Let's talk about this for just a minute, because you talked about them being the worst of the worst. And the Joint Task Force in Guantanamo labeled them as high security risks for a very good reason. We are talking about individuals that have not only killed either directly or indirectly Americans, but frankly, if they weren't in Guantanamo and were captured in Europe, they could have been tried for war crimes, could they not, in terms of the slaughtering of Shiites all through Afghanistan?
Well, there were two of the guys that the United Nations has wanted to bring up on charges of war crimes for killing, by some estimates, thousands of Shiite Muslims. And again, this is one of those things that's often lost sight of, is the barbarity that these Islamists can exhibit towards fellow Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just infidels; it's fellow Muslims, and it's just unspeakable that we've allowed them to escape justice by this transaction. And one thing I just wanted to come back to, Kerby, that you mentioned a moment ago, and we were hearing it like an incantation by the administration when they were first starting to defend this deal, as people learned about what a mistake it was. And that was that we have a sacred duty to leave no man or woman behind on the battlefield. Well, this guy left us.
Yes, that's a good point.
And I think that changes the calculation some. At the very least, it changes how we should be thinking about, what price we might pay to extract him.
I was just thinking about that. I was going to use that phrase a little bit ago, because they talk about the fact that we really want to rescue all those who have put on the uniform of the United States military. But what do you do when a person has taken off the uniform, left his uniform, left his rifle, went out with some water and a knife, and decided in some respects to join the other side? So those are some very important questions that are still on the table.
Absolutely.
And we certainly want to address what this might mean to the civilian population as well. But we need to take one of those mandatory breaks, so we will do so. And along the way, we will open up the phones to give you a chance to join our conversation. Obviously, we're starting here talking with Sergeant Bergdahl, but there's a lot more to cover in terms of some of these foreign policy issues. If you go to our website today, you'll notice that I've posted one of the more recent commentaries by Frank Gaffney. This one, How Obama Ends Wars. We'll get into that because that's the broader theme that we'll be talking about. And also, of course, the threat of Sharia and the threat of radical Islam. And so all of that will be fair game for your comments or questions as we continue our conversation today with Frank Gaffney, founder and president of the Center for Security Policy. As always, we have a link to the Center for Security Policy, or just go to centerforsecuritypolicy.org. We're going to certainly encourage you to find out a little bit more about this outstanding organization and about Frank Gaffney. Need to take a break? We'll continue our conversation with him and then with you right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last few years, there have been a number of attacks on our nation's national motto, In God We Trust. Recently, I had Representative Randy Forbes on my program to talk about these attacks and the victories that often we haven't heard about on most of the mainstream media. A few years ago, a bureaucrat at the Department of Veterans Affairs attempted to ban the flag-folding recitations at military funerals. This phrase was considered inappropriate and unconstitutional. May God grant you grace, mercy, and peace. A funeral home was told by government officials they could not even inform the families that they have the option of requesting prayer at the military services performed by the veterans' honor details. The U.S. Mint attempted to remove the inscription "In God We Trust" from the front of the new presidential coin. The traditional inscriptions of "E Pluribus Unum" and "In God We Trust" were moved to the edge of the coins. The architect of the Capitol refused a teenager's request that a certificate noting his grandfather's love of God, country, and family accompany a souvenir flag that had been flown over the building. The 17-year-old Eagle Scout was told that the word God could not be put on the certificate because it violated a policy banning religious and political expressions on the certificates. Fortunately, in each of these cases, the policies were changed. Representative Forbes even commented that it was good that people on radio were hearing about these victories because they're rarely reported in the media. He then went on to mention another victory. Last month, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts upheld the constitutionality of the phrase "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance. There have been at least 3 failed attempts to challenge "under God" in the pledge. There's sure to be additional challenges, but for now, the phrases like "one nation under God" and "in God we trust" appear secure. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, if you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. Your thoughts about the prisoner exchange. It's certainly been in the news. It's just one of many things we're going to be talking about today, but I thought I'd put that front and center since it has certainly been a conversation and a discussion that has taken place for some time. A little bit later in this hour, we're going to spend some time talking about some of the individuals who are being held captive by Muslims, and we can think of Pastor Saeed, for example. We can think about the possibility of an execution of Miriam Ibrahim, and so there are certainly some very important questions in that area as well. But again, one of the big questions that I think we're going to certainly have to ask is whether or not this is going to make this particular situation more dangerous, because after all, we will again give credit for the fact that the president wanted to bring home someone who was on the battlefield. Whether he was a deserter or not, I think is pretty much resolved now. But the bigger question is that the stated policy, at least of the United States, has been that they do not negotiate with terrorists and they do not negotiate over hostages. Now, the reality is sometimes in back channels that happens, but nevertheless, the stated policy, I think, has kept Americans safe. And now we have a situation in which you have to wonder whether or not this is going to provide an opportunity for those who have taken Americans hostage, taken American soldiers prisoner, whether or not that changes the equation. And I'm afraid to say that we probably won't have to wait too long to see if this prisoner exchange has changed the mindset of some of the terrorists around the country and around the world. So certainly we're going to give you that opportunity to join the conversation. And we have now been able to bring Frank Gaffney in studio. So Frank, thanks for being with us today.
I'm sorry for having been elsewhere until now, but I'm delighted to be with you.
Well, we've done that before. Phone for one segment and in studio for the others. But what about this equation? If indeed we're trading back and forth, would this maybe be a mindset of terrorists to say, maybe if I can capture an individual, civilian or military, I might be able to work out a trade? And that is very different than the so-called stated policy that we will not negotiate with terrorists, we will not negotiate with hostages. Your thoughts?
Look, my guess is that for most of these folks who are enemies of this country, they're interested in getting their hands on our people anyway.
Yeah.
It may be that they wish to massacre them.
Yeah.
which they've been known to do, or torture them and mutilate them and then kill them, which they've been known to do. Or it may be that it will occur to them that they may be able to get something in exchange for their release. I don't know that this particularly changed their calculation, but at the very least, it eliminated any doubt that under this administration, they can exchange people they've managed to get their hands on. And perhaps they're military personnel, perhaps they're diplomats, perhaps they're other non-governmental organization officials, or just citizens. And the trouble is, you don't want to give these guys any more incentives to do us harm. They've got their own hard wiring that tells them to do that.
You know, what I was wondering, too, is since I go to your website here and you're talking about Miriam Ibrahim, or we can talk about Pastor Saeed, in this case, we're dealing with a government to Iran, our government to Sudan. It does seem to me that there is at least a possibility that they might say, okay, we'll release this individual, but we want something for it. In light of what you just gave to the Taliban, we deserve something as well. And I'm not so sure I want to release anyone to Iran or Sudan right now, or any of those individuals that we'd like to rescue from their very horrible fate.
You know, the point that you're really getting at, and that I think is something we can't talk often enough about with the American people, Kerby, is this is a dangerous world.
Yes.
And we're dealing with people who have in mind not just doing harm to us on a retail basis, but doing it on a wholesale basis if they possibly can. Iran, as you mentioned, this is a country that you do not want, the regime, not the people so much, but the regime for sure, you do not want to be incentivizing to be even more aggressive to us than they are. There's every reason to believe at some point, my guess is it's within months, but I've thought that for some time, so maybe it'll be a little longer. But in the very near future, one of the most dangerous regimes on the planet is going to have access to nuclear weapons. And what they will do with them, and to whom, and when, is something we can speculate about. But it does seem to me there's a very high probability they will do something bad with them to somebody that we care about. Maybe ourselves, maybe Israel, maybe others. And all of this signal sending, subliminal may it be, but nonetheless powerful, that we're weak, that we're irresolute, that we're feckless, that we're submissive, most especially, is a very dangerous signal to be sending.
Sure. I want to talk about how we can defend ourselves against that, but we have a few phone calls if you'd like to take one or two. And we'll go first to David in Arizona. You're on with Frank Gaffney, as we're at the moment talking about Sergeant Bergdahl. What are your thoughts about the prisoner exchange?
Well, you kind of broke up on me there, but I think you're talking with me.
I am.
Am I on?
You're on.
Okay. Yeah, one of the points that you brought up about was the legality of this exchange and the president's right to be able to do it with the current policies in place.
Good question.
And I wanted you to elaborate on that a little bit more, on the legality of it.
You know, again, they were supposed to give 30-day notice. Of course, a lot of people have wondered whether that was constitutional, and the president never lets the law get in the way of whatever he thinks he needs to do. But what about the legality? Because we're going to have, of course, Andrew McCarthy on making that case, as others have, that these kinds of actions are impeachable offenses. We'll leave that to him, but your thoughts about the constitutionality of it here?
Well, interestingly, and Andy's a lot smarter on this matter of law than I am, but I will pass on to you what I've received from him and others, that there's no question there is a law on the books that says you may not engage in this kind of transfer without giving 30 days notice to the Congress. It was put into place by the Congress because they adamantly opposed on both sides of the aisle this specific transaction. They'd been talked to about it in the past, and they didn't want any part of it. But here's the kicker. Andy McCarthy and others who have sort of my background in the executive branch feel rather strongly that, as the president said when he signed that law into
so-called signing statement,
signing statement was issued saying, I do not regard this as constitutional, and I will not treat it as an infringement upon what I consider to be my constitutional authorities. Andy's argument, and I think this is probably right, is he may have a point there, but it doesn't alter the fact that he's engaged in dereliction of duty, quite apart from the law, that resulted from this transaction, which is, as I say, so problematic on so many different counts.
Well, let's take another phone call and we'll get into some other issues in just a minute. Richard in Georgia, your thoughts?
Yes, sir. Good to talk to you. I'm younger. I'm 26, and my political views would trend more libertarian. So I'm curious as to your perspective, Christian-wise, and in light of these current scandals, is there room for a libertarian articulation of policy here where we say we don't want to be feckless and release dangerous people, but neither do we want to engage in military entanglements that we don't need? Is there a biblical balance there, or what is your view, coming from your, as our guest talker and also as the host?
Sure, I appreciate that.
Well, I'm probably going to leave the biblical interpretation of this to you,
sure.
Kerby. I would tell you that from my own perspective, I don't believe there's any historical evidence supporting a libertarian approach to this sort of world in which we find ourselves. There may be a different world in which it would apply, but throughout the history of the human race that I'm aware of, it hasn't applied to date, and I don't think it's going to in the near future. My feeling about it is that the theory reduced to its essence, that if we just leave other people alone, they'll leave us alone, does not take into account any of the impulses of the people that we're confronting today and will for the foreseeable future. Not the Russians, not the Chinese, not the Venezuelan regime, not the Islamists, most especially. The last of those being, of course, one that explicitly subscribes, they believe it is directed by Allah, their God, that they must conquer the entire world and subject both Muslims and non-Muslims alike to their program. So leaving them alone is actually interpreted by them as evidence that they can have their way with us. And I think it's, as I said earlier, reckless in the extreme.
We'll come back and talk a little bit more about that, but we have one of these mandatory breaks, and let me right now mention that if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We have in studio with us today Frank Gaffney. We have one of his articles. We have a link to his website, but let me also mention as we go to the break that we're coming to the end of our fiscal year at the end of this month. We have a matching fund that is on the website right now, and we will be mailing information to you as well. And if you appreciate the kind of conversation we have here, this is an opportunity for you to double your donation up to $25,000, and that is available on the website pointofview.net. I'd like to encourage some of you early on to join with us. Don't wait to the last day. Please help us finish this fiscal year strong, and you can simply click on that button that says Matching Fund and give to this ministry. We would greatly appreciate it. We'll continue our conversation with you and Dr. Frank Gaffney right after this.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this.
Let your glory shine down. Let your glory shine down.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back to join our conversation today, we have Frank Gaffney in studio, and he is again the president of the Center for Security Policy, served under the Reagan administration, foreign policy expert, and love to get some of your comments. Richard asked a question that deserves a longer answer, but I thought, at least from a biblical point of view, the way Christians think about this is Romans 13 talks about the fact that government does not bear the sword for nothing. That'd be Romans 13, 1 through 7. And the sword is the idea of protecting you from foreign invaders. And certainly the other part that you mentioned, Frank, was this idea that we live in a dangerous world, and we recognize that there is a sin nature and that we need to protect ourselves from ambitious individuals. We do that domestically by checks and balances, by having ambition, rival ambition. We learned that at Georgetown University and other places by reading the Federalist Papers. But we also protect ourselves from foreign invaders and individuals that intend us harm. And especially when you are talking about something which we've talked about so often, the virulent nature of Islam. Even last week, I had one of my callers, Frank, remind us of the Barbary pirates, the Marines going to the shores of Tripoli. It didn't take long for us to recognize, even with first George Washington, John Adams, and especially under Thomas Jefferson, the need that we would be fighting Islam. And that battle took place in the early part of the 19th century. We're still fighting that battle here today in the 21st century, aren't we?
Well, sadly, and I think, as I said earlier, a large part of why we're fighting it today is that they are determined to wage war against us. They are determined to fulfill what, as I said earlier, they believe is their divine writ. And so just to go back to the question posed to us, I don't think our passivity or disengagement, let alone our weakness, is going to dissuade that from happening. In fact, I think it is actually doctrinally something that will only compel them to redouble their efforts, as the Quran says, to make us feel subdued.
Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that we need to understand, the danger of Islam. Not all Muslims are terrorists, but most all terrorists are Muslims. So I don't want to paint with a broad brush. But those radical Muslims or Islamists, or whatever phrase you want to use, have as their desire to take some of the very important statements in, for example, the various surahs in the Quran. They take them literally. They believe that you should go out and subdue individuals. They believe in Sharia law. They believe in dhimitude. And we are seeing how that's played out, just as we were talking just a few minutes ago about one individual, Miriam Ibrahim, who will be put to death if we do not intervene in some way.
Yeah. Well, I hope not. There have been some noises made by the government of Sudan that they will, spare her life, or if they can find her insane, then the sentence will be, commuted. But whether it's Miriam as a single individual, and in this case, of course, as you know, a Christian,
yes,
who has been accused wrongly of being both an apostate from Islam and an adulterer, both of which are capital offenses, and who has now had a child in prison, and another child previously born also there with her for these months. And the cruelty of this program is hard to overstate. And it really brings me back to something you mentioned a moment ago, Kerby. I think the good news is that there are an enormous number of Muslims around the world who do not practice their faith in accordance with the dictates of Sharia. They don't want to live under it themselves, or don't even really know what it's about. It's not part of their faith tradition. But then there are others for whom this is the authentic faith, and it must be followed, or you are an apostate and you are subject to a death penalty. Our purpose, it seems to me, ought to be working with where we can, and certainly holding up Muslims who do not pose that
Right.
sort of threat to us. And instead, and what's been so maddening about this administration, including notably Hillary Clinton, who we will be hearing more about in the weeks ahead because she will be out flogging her new book, is that they have in fact embraced, I think, if not actually exclusively, certainly virtually exclusively, the wrong sorts of Muslims, Muslim Brotherhood operatives specifically, and front groups and organizations and the like, who differ from other Sharia adherent Muslims, notably the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or other groups, only in terms of their tactics. And that is to say that they ultimately want the same thing, and they are ultimately perfectly willing to use violence to accomplish it. In fact, I think that's the preferred method. It's just that for the moment, they don't believe that they're strong enough in the West to use violence, and therefore they must use this, what's called civilization jihadist techniques and subversion.
We've talked about that with you before. Let's take
Indeed.
matter of fact, this is a caller here that's kind of making your point. So let's go to South Carolina this time. Arthur, WKCL. I understand you're retired military. First of all, thank you for your service.
You're welcome. How you doing today, sir?
Very good. What would you like to say?
Well, actually, after, much study and everything and living overseas amongst this type of individual mindset and what I see in this administration, I'm seeing a lot of this administration, especially coming from the president, the condonement of their acts. And it's leading me to believe, just watching him and listening to him, the way he goes about signing bills and allowing these 5 terrorists to go free, he really is creating his own terrorism. It seems like he's trying to create a holy war. I might be wrong in that, but this whole administration seems very condoning to the Islamic community of the radicals, and I totally disagree with that.
Certainly. Well,
I
Frank,
agree
that's sort of what you said, right?
I agree with you and disagree with that as well. And I think you've put it in a different way, and perhaps better, but you're certainly right on this count. Whatever the president's motivations are, and wherever he thinks this is going to lead, what he's doing is creating conditions that will put us at greater risk. And I don't simply mean, though I put them at the top of the list, the men and women we have in uniform serving in places like Afghanistan at the moment. I mentioned a couple of others, diplomats, as we saw in Benghazi. You have lots of Americans who are in various parts of the world, including many of these Muslim countries in which this jihadist fervent, Sharia campaign is underway, Nigeria being just one example. Those people, non-governmental organization, charitable, good works sorts of folks are at risk as well, and I think even tourists. So for all these reasons, to say nothing of us here at home, where ultimately I think they seek to impose their will, this kind of conduct by the president really is malfeasant. It is a dereliction of duty. It does constitute, in my judgment, high crimes and misdemeanors, which goes back to the point of Andy's book. That's something that is not simply a matter of making the legal case. You have to have the political will to take the steps that the Constitution affords us to remove someone from office who is engaged in this kind of behavior. That political will, it seems to me, has not been present till now, but maybe if people really recognize the threat that's now metastasizing, it might emerge.
Let's take one more phone call real quickly, and then I want to get into, can we defend ourselves? But let's go to Amy in Maine. Amy, thank you for calling today.
Hi, thank you for listening. I actually have recently, in the last couple of years, converted to Islam. My mother was a Baptist, my father was a Catholic, and I was raised Mormon. So I know the Bible hands up and down and believe in it. And one point I wanted to make first, and then I have a question. I really believe that true Islam is a loving umbrella, and Allah, if you look it up, means God, and it embraces everything. They believe in Jesus Christ. They believe in I'm using the word I don't like, they, like you group all Islam people together. And I'm glad the speaker made the point that we're not all the same. And there are many peaceful Islamic people in this world. But how do we go about changing the mindset of the difference between these factions that are terrorists and just believe in the facade, the strict by the book, converting the whole world? Like, how do we go about changing our country? When I spend time in Istanbul and stuff, do you know how many people hate us? Like, how do we go about changing the mindset of how people view Americans?
I think that's a good question. We have one of those mandatory breaks. We'll come back and talk about that. And we've already sort of alluded to that, the emphasis on moderate Muslims, if we can find them, and what to do. We'll talk about that right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Frank Gaffney in studio with us, and we're going to talk about a couple of resources that you certainly want to know about. But Amy raised a good question. I would disagree there. I think there's some foundational differences theologically between Muslims and Christians. We'll leave that for another day. Matter of fact, we're going to have another program on it, so we'll let her call in. We'll get into the theology. But the practical matter is there are a lot of people around the world that hate us. There are a lot of Muslims who might have more affinity for democracy and a republic and constitutional matters, but nevertheless are being pulled into the Islamist camp because of their hatred for America or their belief that to be a true Muslim, I have to have a literal interpretation of the 100+ verses, which are basically the verses of the sword. So how do we turn that around, or can we?
It's a very important question, and I'm not sure I know an answer to it. I will say, I think that if you look at many of the countries around the world in which we are hated, as they say, I think part of that is just a function of envy. You know, we have a quality of life that they could only dream of, and naturally that breeds a certain animosity. With many of these countries, it seems to me you can't really hope to dissuade them from enmity like that. You can only try to persuade them that they don't want to screw around with you. And that's where what President Reagan used to call peace through strength comes in, and it's a philosophy that I very strongly embrace and our center works on. As to this question about, the different kinds of Islam, I think that we should be clear. The people who are the authorities of the faith embrace Sharia and insist that it is the true faith. I make the distinction between Sharia adherent Muslims and those that aren't simply because I think it is the fault line between the ones that are unquestionably a problem and those that are, at least for the moment, not. But you are absolutely right, Kerby. They are being subjected every day to pressure, to conform to these Islamists and their agenda, not least because the Islamists have money.
Yeah.
And are using it increasingly to try to bring their children or they themselves into the fold. And this is why, as I said earlier, I am so concerned about anything we do to embolden these guys or strengthen them or create the impression that they are the legitimate spokespeople for the faith by, having endorsed them at the governmental level.
Let me, if I can, just since we are almost out of time, talk about a couple of things that we always like to deal with you. And one of those is sooner or later, and I hope it's much later, I hope it's never, but there are going to be bad actors who are going to have access to a nuclear weapon. And the question then becomes, what can we do to protect us? And many people say, well, what can one nuclear weapon do? Well, it's maybe could take out a portion of the country, but if you could explode that nuclear weapon in the upper atmosphere, this electromagnetic pulse could bring us back to the 19th century, just completely wipe out the electronics in America. Your argument is we need to do something now for a relatively minor cost to protect our power grid from what could indeed happen in the future. Tell us more, if you might.
Well, you've said it very well. I think you captured one part of this frightening prospect, is that our grid, upon which all aspects of life really depend these days, is exceedingly vulnerable. It turns out that's not the only kind of attack. That happens to be the most efficient, I think, by far. A single nuclear weapon at a high altitude, 300 miles or so, could conceivably take down our electric grid coast to coast and have a cascading destructive effect on all of the rest of the critical infrastructures. But you can do it retail in other ways, including notably an attack that took the kind of attack that took place in Northern California in April of 2013, which very nearly, literally, but for the grace of God, would have taken out a critical part of that area's grid and possibly blacked out Silicon Valley and San Francisco Bay, much of it, perhaps for years. What we need to be doing about this is made all the more urgent because even if none of the people who knows how vulnerable our grid is actually acts to destroy it, the sun is going to do it. We are probably overdue now for an intense solar flare that could have a similar effect to the high-altitude electromagnetic pulse phenomenon you talked about. And the good news, Kerby, there's a lot of bad news here, but the good news is we know what to do to shield these critical elements of our electric grid, the power generating facilities, the control rooms, the transmission nodes, and the communication system. It's just a question of having the will and the policy, in place to do it. And the money is not trivial, but I think it is eminently manageable, especially compared to the costs of what it would take to try to rebuild the country after the power goes out and stays out.
If people wanted to read a little bit more about that, we've posted some of the articles you've written in the past, but let's for just a minute talk about what is available on your website there, the Center for Security Policy.org. There are a number of articles about that. There's also a course that people can take to learn more about Sharia law. So just before we let you go, talk about all the great resources you have there.
Well, thank you. We've got a wonderful team of people we work with, and they've helped us put a number of products together. You mentioned some on the Sharia course and material. Let me come to that in a minute. Just on the grid issue, we actually have a dedicated website called securethegrid.com, at which you can find also at our site, which is, what is it? securefreedom.org. Forgive me, the senior moment there. A book that is available for free, you can download, called Guilty Knowledge: What the U.S. government knows about the vulnerability of our electric grid but refuses to fix. And this compiles the executive summaries of 11 different studies that describe one part or the other of this threat scenario and come to the same conclusion: we've got to fix the grid. On the Sharia issue and many others besides, at securefreedom.org, we do have a wealth of information, including a book that is also available, downloadable for free, on the secret plan of the Muslim Brotherhood for destroying us stealthily from within. And a book that we happen to have a copy of right here.
Yes.
It talks about one of the prime movers behind the civilization jihad against, of all people, the Republican Party, a fellow by the name of Grover Norquist. So that and much more is available at our sites.
Well, just lots of great resources, and I do want to encourage people to educate themselves about this, and I appreciate you being in studio with us today. I know we will be able to do this again, and we spent a little bit of time talking about Sergeant Bergdahl, but there are all sorts of other issues, and I wanted people to know more about this idea of how to protect ourselves from an electromagnetic pulse, the fact that you can actually take a course and learn a little bit more about radical jihad and radical Islam, and certainly learn a little bit more about civilization jihad. Some of these may be new terms to you, and so we encourage people to read and to find out a little bit more. So thanks for being in studio with us.
At MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. That's the site dedicated to that particular course.
Again, MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. And so, again, lots of great resources, a lot of links that are also at Center for Security Policy. We've posted that there, and encourage you to visit that website. The first article today by Frank Gaffney, How Obama Ends Wars, and I would encourage you to click there because then you can get his regular commentary. And, of course, we have the link to the Center for Security Policy. We'll post up some of the others, Secure the Grid and some of the others, and you'll be able to find them all at our website, pointofview.net. Let me, just before we take a break, mention again that we have a matching fund on the table, and this is an opportunity between now and the end of our fiscal year, end of this month, and we certainly do depend upon your financial gifts to bring programs like this. Think of how very rare you hear some of the conversations on other media outlets that we talk about here, and have a chance to talk today with Frank Gaffney, and then we're going to get into some other topics in the second hour today. So we certainly encourage you to support this ministry, and you can do so certainly by writing to us, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. But the simplest way for many of you is simply to go to our website, pointofview.net. That middle button there says Matching Fund, double your donation, and that match is already at $25,000. So let me encourage that if you are thinking about a gift of $100, well, it becomes $200. A gift of $500 becomes $1,000. So think about what you might do to support this ministry. Let's take a break, and we'll come back with more right after this.
Across the nation, this is Point of View. For materials offered during the broadcast, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
I can't stop thinking about you. Jesus, I love you. How I adore you. I can't stop thinking about you.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about the issue of artificial reproduction. This is a topic we've addressed from time to time here on Point of View. And on the one hand, we'd certainly have to say that any new technology that is allowing us to treat and cure male or female infertility is a good thing. It is an issue that we're certainly going to have to deal with more and more in the 21st century. I say oftentimes when I speak to pastors in a seminary class that if you look out over your congregation, maybe about 10% of the couples that are married may be dealing with an issue of infertility. But we're going to deal with one of the very strong concerns that people have about artificial reproduction in terms of how it threatens the sanctity of human life or the moral integrity of the family. In particular, what about surrogate parenting? And this is why we wanted to give you an opportunity to know about a series of films. The third has just come out, called Breeders, a Subclass of Women, and it is something that has come from the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network. The president is Jennifer Lahl, and she is with us. She has been involved very much in not only producing this film, but previous ones, Exploitation, about the ethics of human egg donation, as well as Anonymous Father's Day, about men and women that are created by anonymous sperm donors. So we're going to get into all of those issues. You might remember one of the other films that she worked on as an associate producer called Lines That Divide, the Great Stem Cell Debate. So lots of issues we can talk about today. Jennifer is the founder and president of the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network. She also serves on the North American editorial board for the International Journal of Ethics and Medicine. Also serves on the board of reference for Johnny Erickson Tada's Christian Institute on Disability. Jennifer, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks, Kerby, for having me.
We have on our website here the 2-minute trailer that is on this new film, Breeders. I would encourage all of our listeners to watch it, then hit the share button and put it on your Facebook page, send it to individuals, put it on a blog if you have a blog, educate others about this issue. It will really start a dialogue that I think many people will appreciate. I've also taken the time to post an article about the films that you've been involved with, and of course have a link to your website. But maybe give us a little bit of the history. This latest one, called Breeders, is really the third of a trilogy of films. Take us through each one for just a minute before we get into that one, just so that people understand some of the great resources that would be available to them that they can use in their church, in their Christian school, and maybe even help other people think through some of the ethical implications of some of these new artificial technologies.
Sure. Thank you for giving me such a great introduction, too, and a platform to speak about things that I really don't think we're wrestling deeply with at all in our churches. I often ask religious audiences when I'm before them, how many have heard a sermon recently preached on the barren womb and infertility in light of these 21st century modern technologies? So I've been writing and speaking and traveling around the world for over 12 years, speaking about assisted reproductive technology and specifically what's called third-party reproduction, which is where you use egg and or sperm and or womb from an outside party member. So, our first film we made was on egg donation or egg selling. You cannot do human cloning or embryonic stem cell research without eggs, because eggs are necessary for making embryos to do research on and also for doing human cloning research. And because of my graduate work and studies in bioethics, these are issues that are very much a part of our organization. So I was meeting and speaking to so many women that I'd met that made the decision to sell their eggs because they had student loan debt, because they were low income. They saw the ad saying, be an angel, help somebody, make dreams come true, all this altruistic, loving language. And they were seriously harmed. In my previous career, I was a nurse for 20-plus years, so I was really concerned with the health issues. And when exploitation came out, I started hearing from donor-conceived people. We call them, the U.S. Census has a new category. Are you donor-conceived?
Donor-conceived,
because so we made Anonymous Father's Day, which tells the story of what it's like not knowing who your biological father is. And then to complete the series, we had to, of course, tell the story of surrogacy. Surrogacy is in the Bible, so it's a topic that we have total permission to talk about. And infertility is in the Bible, so we should, be wrestling with these issues. And through documentary filmmaking and telling stories, we've been able to really have an impact in educating and informing people.
Yes, when people hear that, they go, it's in the Bible? Yeah, well, Abraham and Sarah certainly fits into the surrogate. Infertility, Hannah. So we certainly, whether we're talking about Genesis or 1 Samuel or what other passages, certainly are going to get into those. But again, I think that I want to emphasize, because I know as we open up the phones, there are going to be people calling in saying, well, are you against all these technologies? No, I mean, anything that can treat or cure, let's in this case look at female infertility, that does not require us to destroy embryos, does not bring a third party into the pregnancy. Those are things that I think are permissible, although, again, some Christians might have questions about that. But we are talking about something that is far beyond this, and it's a good illustration that I think when I wrote my first book on genetic engineering, 32 years ago, that makes me feel really old, back in 1982 when genetic engineering came out, I at the time was saying that the technology is moving faster than the legal precedents and faster than the legislatures to catch up. Well, now, 3 decades later, we still have that problem because as I watch your film, it seems to me that in many cases, we still have surrogate mothers out there in kind of legal limbo, don't we?
That's absolutely true. And in our film, we sort of tease out the implications of what happens when making a baby gets, sort of resolved within legal contracts, and in what people are told they have to do or they don't have to do. Like one surrogate in the film was told she had to terminate the pregnancy, have an abortion, because the child she was carrying was diagnosed with a disability. And she really struggled with that because she felt that she had this little boy's life in her hands and it was her body and it was her decision. But, she was told by the people who were paying her, basically, you work for us, we hired you for a job, you do what we tell you to do. So it is very complicated. And not only are our laws lagging behind and not keeping up, nor is our theological understanding of these issues and our ability as Christians to think critically about what does it mean to, hire another woman or to buy eggs or sperm from somebody else to have a child.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll come back and continue our conversation for a few minutes. And then, of course, as always, open up the phones to give you a chance to join our conversation. Jennifer Lahl with us today. She is the founder and president of the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network. And we are talking about the latest film, which we have a trailer for on our website, Breeders, a Subclass of Women. But let me mention it's the third of a trilogy. Earlier ones, Eggsploitation, as well as Anonymous Father's Day. And we will get into the aspects of this, but also, of course, we will open up the phones to give you a chance to join our conversation. 1-800-351-1212. We certainly recognize the issue of infertility, recognize it's important for us to do what we can to provide children for those of you that certainly want them, but we have ethical questions. We'll talk about that right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
Over the last few years, there have been a number of attacks on our nation's national motto, In God We Trust. Recently, I had Representative Randy Forbes on my program to talk about these attacks and the victories that often we haven't heard about on most of the mainstream media. A few years ago, a bureaucrat at the Department of Veterans Affairs attempted to ban the flag-folding recitations at military funerals. This phrase was considered inappropriate and unconstitutional. May God grant you grace, mercy, and peace. A funeral home was told by government officials they could not even inform the families that they have the option of requesting prayer at the military services performed by the veterans' honor details. The U.S. Mint attempted to remove the inscription, In God We Trust, from the front of the new presidential coin. The traditional inscriptions of E Pluribus Unum and In God We Trust were moved to the edge of the coins. The architect of the Capitol refused a teenager's request that a certificate noting his grandfather's love of God, country, and family accompany a souvenir flag that had been flown over the building. The 17-year-old Eagle Scout was told that the word God could not be put on the certificate because it violated a policy banning religious and political expressions on the certificates. Fortunately, in each of these cases, the policies were changed. Representative Forbes even commented that it was good that people on radio were hearing about these victories because they're rarely reported in the media. He then went on to mention another victory. Last month, the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts upheld the constitutionality of the phrase, Under God, in the Pledge of Allegiance. There have been at least 3 failed attempts to challenge Under God in the Pledge. There's sure to be additional challenges, but for now, the phrases like, One nation under God, and In God we trust, appear secure. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Talking today with Jennifer Lahl, president of the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network. And I might just mention that this particular film, Breeders, a Subclass of Women, raises really vital questions about surrogacy and takes you through the experience of 4 women and some of the unexpected consequences and even the heart-wrenching emotions that they had to deal with. And I want to go through each one of those, Jennifer. But before we do, let's back up for just a minute and talk about the other women, the couple that wants the child. When, as I mentioned a minute ago, I wrote a book years ago, decades ago now, on genetic engineering, I expected that when my book came out that there would be all sorts of questions about gene splicing, because that was the primary emphasis in the book, and I put some additional chapters on artificial reproduction, especially since we'd had our first in vitro baby that had been born. I was completely caught off guard because my phone began to ring, and it wasn't from people raising questions about genetics. It was from couples who were infertile that wanted to know what was possible, either morally or just even technologically. And I remember at the time, so many of these sort of modern day Hannahs were saying, I will do anything to have a child. And it does seem to me that that's part of what drives this problem, this desire to have a child at any cost, and this desire to, as in a sense, exploit others, not intentionally, probably unintentionally, but that exploitation that you document in the film goes back to this sheer desire, which is an admirable desire to have children, that maybe drives this whole industry. What are your thoughts?
Yes, and I do see that. You'll hear women talk about, desperation and grief and loss, and those are all, real, legitimate feelings. But as I read Scripture, I like to say, in the garden, when the creation account was finished and God called everything good, there was just Adam and Eve, and they were a complete couple. Adam needed a helpmate, and he got Eve, and, it was wonderful. And children are a blessing, and children are a gift. And sometimes we think we have a right, or we're entitled to, or we have to have a gift. Well, it's not a gift if, you have to have it, as you say, at any cost. And that's the problem when we start seeing people in that desperation, willing to sort of go outside of moral bounds to do whatever and to push those limits because they so desperately want that child. And God hasn't given it to them for whatever reason. And we can talk about the reasons for infertility,
sure,
which are many. But I think we have to just stop and pause. And I think that's where the church's role is perhaps missing, in just really educating into sort of the life of the church. When you get up, when you lay down, when you walk alongside the road, talk about the fact that some couples will be barren. For whatever reason, God has other things planned for them. He doesn't have children planned for them, or children in the natural way that couples often have children. Maybe he has children planned through adoption, or through foster parenting, or through being, wonderful aunts, or running children's ministry. I mean, God gives us children in all different ways, but how can we stop and sort of reflect instead of what I say, get on that super highway that the in vitro fertilization track puts you on, because you're letting desperation sort of drive your decision making, and you are willing to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars pursuing these very costly and highly ineffective, with high failure rates, technologies.
Sure. You mentioned the reason for infertility. There are many, and I thought we might mention that for just a minute before we get into the story of these four women, and that is sometimes congenital abnormalities, hormonal changes, low-level gynecological infections. There are a lot of reasons why you are seeing a fairly significant number of women who are infertile and are looking for alternatives in order to have a child.
Yes, and we live in a more modern-day society now, so women and men are waiting later to have children, and we've realized that the biological clock is a reality, and our fertile days really are numbered, and we're not, we can't necessarily wait until later in our 30s as we often thought we could, and we had plenty of time. Obesity. We have a huge problem with obesity in Western countries, and obesity really drives infertility in both men and women. There's infertility for just reasons we don't know. I mean, the couples will go through all the diagnostic workups, and the doctors will come back and say, we don't know why you can't reproduce. We can't find anything wrong, but for some reason you can't. So part of my work is just sort of, doing that education that, how do we understand what happens when children don't come, and what do we do with all the cafeteria choices that modern technology waves out as the answer to your problem?
If you'd like to join us, since calls are already coming in, 1-800-351-1212. Jennifer Lahl with us as we talk with her. She is with the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network. We have a link to the website. We have an article about this new film, and also documents the previous ones, and most importantly, the video that I would encourage you to watch. message and maybe hit that share button, put it on your Facebook page, your blog, or to send it to others. Let's talk briefly before we take some phone calls about these women. I'll take of the child born through surrogate parenting first. You have that story about her. And you would think, well, a child would be grateful to be born into the world, but whether you were born into the world because of a contract that brought you into being, or back to the anonymous Father's Day where you're born into the world and you will never know who your father is, there are some psychological effects to that, are there not?
Yes, and you're speaking of Jessica, who's just a beautiful young woman in the film, and I just came to love and admire her greatly in getting to know her and making the film. And she was born of what is called a traditional surrogacy arrangement, and there was a contract. Her mother and father were infertile, and so they hired, another woman in the state of Michigan to have a baby for them. And she talks about just how complicated that was for her growing up. She never really felt connected to her mother, who raised her in the home. She didn't find out until she was a teenager that this was even her story, although she was, as you often hear with kids adopted, when they're finally told, they kind of go, oh, I knew it all along, now it finally makes sense, the pieces sort of fall into place. Secrets are just very devastating on families and children. So as a teenager, she, was sort of rustling through some papers at home because she had to find a health document for, a PE class at school, and that's how she discovered when she was in her 30s, she finally met and found her birth mother, or her real mother, her first mother, whatever. There's all kinds of language for what we have to call these women now. And it's been really a rocky road for her because she's spoken out against the practice. And as you say, people say, well, why aren't you grateful? If not for this, you wouldn't be here. But, we could say the same thing to somebody who was born a product of rape. They don't have to necessarily endorse rape, but if not for the rape, they wouldn't be here.
Sure.
And so that her speaking out against the practice has sort of disenfranchised her from her family because they're saying, well, why aren't you just happy?
Yeah, very powerful stories. Let me take one more, and then we'll take a break and then come back and take some calls and work our way through it. But you have another individual that was the surrogate mother who honestly just thought I was doing this to help another couple. But as you alluded to just a minute ago, there's kind of you're kind of like, you're a hired breeder. You're kind of a reproductive slave. I'm maybe using a little bit of hyperbole here, but the impact that this has had on the surrogate mothers, many of who, interestingly enough, I did not know until your video, are in the military and, of course, have had children before, feel very exploited by the system that we have today, and there don't seem to be a whole lot of laws that protect them and their circumstances. True?
Absolutely, and this is the same experience we've had with the release of the earlier two films. As soon as the film comes out, more people come forward and tell us their stories. And so there's so many of these women that truly went into it to help somebody. One woman we interviewed was helping a family member, a brother and his wife. Another woman was helping a really good friend. And so these are people that had relationships already together and really went into it with this strong desire to help a couple who otherwise couldn't have a child. And things went terribly wrong, things that you could never anticipate going wrong, things that you could never say, well, we just need better contracts, and as long as the contract language is so, clear, because there's so much that happens. God teaches us that we've been knit together in our mother's womb. And there's so much that happens with mothers and children in utero, in bonding, that's good and wonderful and should be nurtured and encouraged. And we can't anticipate what it's going to be like to carry that child for all that long period of time and then just give the child away.
Well, we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we will take some phone calls. We have quite a number of you that have already called in, so we'll give you that chance to chat with Jennifer Lahl. But let me just mention that one of the things we're also talking about today is we're coming to the end of our fiscal year. It ends on June 30th. It is really critical that we end our fiscal year on a strong financial footing. And due to the generosity of a few key partners, we have established a $25,000 matching fund. So that means that your gift today will be doubled, and you can give online by going to pointofview.net. Matter of fact, you can simply click on the button there on our webpage, and that's a way in which you can help us continue to bring these programs to you and end this fiscal year in a strong way. Of course, you can also write a check to Point of View and send it to Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. This is a way that you can help Point of View equip listeners to make their faith an active part of their lives to impact the culture, and an opportunity for you to hear conversation about very important issues like this one today of the issue of artificial reproduction. So we'll take a break. We'll come back and take your phone calls right after these messages.
You are listening to Point of View. For materials offered during the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number, 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. Point of View will continue after this.
you're glorified with all my life. Let your glory shine down. Let your glory shine down.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
I'd like to join our conversation today. We are privileged to have with us Jennifer Lahl. She is the president of the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network. You can go to that website there and find out a great deal about what we are talking about today, and in particular focusing on this particular new documentary called Breeders. And really the legality of surrogacy is kind of a hot button issue right now. There are various states that either have or will consider legislation, from New York to Louisiana. I know the District of Columbia has had some considerations as well. So a lot of states are dealing with this issue. And if you would like to know a little bit more about this, we first of all encourage you to go to that website, which we have a link to on our website. We also have an opportunity for you to also watch the trailer. It's about 2 minutes long for Breeders, a subclass of women, and see if indeed that would be something you would want to know more about, or certainly also hit that share button and pass that on to others. Jennifer, talk about some of the resources that are available, because we've mentioned that this is the third of 3 different films, and if listeners wanted to purchase one for their own personal use, maybe put it in their church library, maybe make it available to a Christian school, whatever they might want to do, pass it on to other doctors. What are the resources that you might have available to some of our listeners today?
Sure. Well, obviously the films are all available for purchase and are video on demand, so if people don't like to buy DVDs, they just like to watch films on their computers, they can do that. Exploitation has just been picked up and it's going to be released all over the world on iTunes and Netflix next month. We also developed a study guide that goes with the whole entire 3-film series. You can use them separately if you only want to show one particular, or you can, show the whole series. But it actually walks you through some questions for discussion and raises some concerns and just helps to lead and facilitate a discussion. We also have maps on our website, so if you're wondering, what does the law in your particular state say about surrogacy, or can you sell your eggs? Here, I live in the state of California, which is where I'm calling from right now. I like to refer to my state as the Wild, Wild West. Anything goes. Elton John came to California twice to have his babies via surrogacy and egg donation. Octumom obviously gave birth here. All the Hollywood celebrities that use surrogates. So if you are just interested in what's happening in your particular state, we have resources like that available. Plus, we just write regularly on the topic of assisted reproductive technologies.
So again, Center for Bioethics and Culture Network. We have a link to the website. And let's, if we can, take some phone calls as we move our way through this conversation today. We'll start in the state of Texas, KJRT. Christy, thank you for calling today.
Hi, Kerby. Hi, Jennifer. I just wanted to throw this out to you, and that is, as far as the Christian community is concerned, what about the concept of our faith and believing God to have a child? Taking God's word, just like, Abraham and Sarah, they had to take what God had given them as his word to them and say, you know what? And I always love the fact that the Lord even waited until they just, neither one of them could really do anything anymore. I mean, it was done, and that's when they had Isaac, and I think to myself, as Christians, we should be one step above what the world is doing and what they're thinking and how they're operating, and we should be taking what we want out of the kingdom of God, out of the resources of heaven, and that way people who are in the world, who are in that situation, they'll look at us and say, wow, you wanted to have a child and you did it. How did you do it? And that's an opportunity to not only help someone in that area, but lead them into the kingdom, bring them to Jesus Christ. I mean, I think so often that we've gotten so sucked into the way the world thinks and what they do and how they do things. And we've stepped so far away from the Word of God sometimes, it's getting serious.
Well, good
You know
points.
what I mean?
Yeah. Great admonition, Christy. Thank you for starting us off there, because that is certainly an issue. You just mentioned a minute ago that there are some that will say, well, yeah, I can't have a child. Two homosexual men, you just mentioned Elton John, said, well, I've got to use a surrogate mother in some way or another, so at least I have a child that's genetically related to one of us. But that just, again, is an attempt by the culture to circumvent what God intended. And some of these get so convoluted. I remember, for example, the court case. I remember last time I was at Baylor Law School, we were debating the one about this woman that wanted to take some of the frozen embryos and implant them in her after they had been divorced. And the husband brought suit because he said, I don't want you to have any more children, because according to the way the laws are written, even though we're not married anymore, those would still be biologically my children, but those are babies on ice. And you've had the baby M's and all these other situations where William and Elizabeth Stern hired an individual to actually have a child, and then in the New Jersey courts had to sort these out. These surrogate and egg donation cases get so convoluted, and there really isn't too much of an ethical framework, because the Bible always assumed that the children born were biologically related to the father and mother, with the exception of adoption. Now we're mixing and matching sperm and egg and wombs and everything else. I don't think the laws will ever be able to make any sense out of it, and we certainly have gone far beyond what I think would be some of the biblical basis for those ethical decisions in the first place. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I just think that, we do need to, hit the pause button. People always ask me, how do you keep from getting discouraged? And I think, well, this is just the way the world goes. That doesn't mean we throw in the towel and raise the white flag, and as your caller to say, we just start acting like the world. I mean, we don't have to use the technologies just because they're available.
Right.
And we have massive educational programs telling people not to smoke cigarettes. We don't throw people in jail and criminalize cigarette smoking, but we sure work really hard saying this isn't the best thing for you. Don't do this. I think similarly in the case of assisted reproductive technology, everybody has some cross that they have to bear. We know single people that don't feel called to a life of singleness and celibacy, but that's where God has them. And so they have to learn to accept where they are and to be grateful for what God has for them. It might be something different. We don't always all get the same exact thing, and we don't always get what we want. So how do we say no to these technologies which seem so pervasive? We have almost 750,000 frozen human embryos in the United States.
That's right.
We need to just, stop freezing the image of God. I mean, isn't the image of God in its tiny beginning stage more worthy of a dignity that's not just plops it into the freezer? But again, because we're not thinking, we're not being challenged to think, and we're being motivated by desperation and feeling like, well, God says to be fruitful and multiply. I'm being disobedient, and I have to use this technology so I can be fruitful and multiply. So I'm just thankful for this opportunity to be on your program and talk to your listeners.
Well, certainly something we've talked about a little bit in the past, and I appreciate you doing such a great job through these documentaries, pointing out some of the concerns that should be front and center to all citizens, but most importantly to our state legislators. You're from California. Let's go to a caller in California listening on KYCC. Jack, thank you for calling today.
Thanks for taking my call. Jennifer, I wanted to throw a couple of things at you. I spoke with a guy who shared with me, and I've heard this kind of subject on Point of View before, about China's gender ratio problem, where they have basically 40 million bare branches, 40 million excess of males. And the gentleman that I spoke to, he suggested, along the lines of the topic you're talking about, he said, well, why don't we just start doing sex selection? Because he said anthropologically, biologically, in nature, 105 males are born per 100 women. That's the natural That's the natural ratio of male to female. You can look that up on any scholarly study online with gender ratio. And his suggestion was that, okay, well, since this is going on, we've got this problem. What is morally wrong with? He explained to me that the sperm, there's two kinds to dumb it down. Basically, he said there's two kinds. There's the one that swims fast, and when that one fertilizes the egg, it produces the male child. The one that swims slower, when it makes it to fertilization, that produces the female. And he says he didn't believe that it would be playing God to select the sex of the child. I'd like to know how you feel about that, and I'd like to hear some comments about gender ratio problems that I believe is being exacerbated by immigration policies in America, where it tends to be that when immigrants are allowed to come in greater numbers, it's usually males that migrate to America, and they're also driving up those ratios. So if you could comment on those, I appreciate it.
Take a break. Be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Jennifer Lahl with us for a few more minutes as we are talking today about artificial reproductive technology. President of the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network. And if you just joined us, been talking about this new film coming out, Breeders, a Subclass of Women, which really, in a sense, completes a trilogy about the ethics of third-party reproduction. Some of the earlier ones we mentioned, Exploitation, which was about the ethics of human egg donation, as well as Anonymous Father's Day, about women and men created by an anonymous sperm donor. Jack asked a good question. Let me give some basic biology, Jennifer, and that is that a woman contributes an X chromosome. A male contributes either an X or a Y. An XY would be a male, an XX would be a female. There seems to be some evidence that Y sperm travel differently than X sperm, so putting it through a gel electrophoresis or other things, you would move the ratio from 50-50, not to 100-0, but I've heard some people say maybe you could change the ratio from to 80-20, 70-30, something like that. That, first of all, would bring you to, if indeed somebody wanted to do that, you'd have to use artificial insemination by the husband. And, there's nothing necessarily morally improper about that, although I know people in the Catholic Church believe even that intervention would be inappropriate. But you're talking about separating X sperm from Y sperm. That's very different than destroying an embryo or a fetus. So from a technological point of view, it is possible. From a moral point of view, it is possible. I just don't know in China whether they're ready to do that. And we've had programs in this program where we've talked about the incredible kind of sex selection by abortion that has taken place in China. And we've seen the devastating results in which you have a much higher ratio of men to women in China because of the one-child policy. But any moral questions you might want to raise about that, Jennifer?
Yeah, I think, Jack raised a lot of really important points about this whole movement in assisted reproductive technology. I mean, actually, gender selection, it's not even, I wouldn't call it abortion, perhaps, but it's happening in the laboratory when you're mixing egg and sperm and creating the embryos right there in the laboratory. True. Because they're always tested. And couples are asked, do you want us to implant, 2 or 3? Do you want us to implant the boys or the girls? Do you want one of each? There's a great book out there called Unnatural Selection, which really is doing a good job is crunching the numbers of what's happening outside in China, in particular in India, where, boys are preferred over girls. But in fact, it happens here. And it's again, one of the cafeteria menu options when a couple finds himself in the IVF clinic. Do you want a girl or a boy? Because we can pick. We have that technology available to us. Some would say, are we playing God here? Have we lost sight of the fact that children are a gift and a blessing, and you don't get to pick your gifts. It's not a gift if you pick it. It's something you pick. C.S. Lewis's great essay, The Abolition of Man, talks about the man molders. I mean, here we are tinkering with people to the point where we have these unnatural gender balances. China's going to predict that in just a short time they're going to have a huge HIV/AIDS epidemic because there's not going to be enough women to go around for men, and then that will just increase, sexual promiscuity and visiting brothels, and all these unintended consequences when we think we are wise in our own eyes and can do these things without thinking deeply about them and thinking, long term.
One of the things we do around this round table every once in a while is do a conversation about science fiction films. And the reason I do that is sometimes they are probably the best way to illustrate some of those issues. And one of those that we talked about recently was Gattaca. Now, for some of our younger listeners, they're going to say, I've never heard of that film, because it's somewhat an older film. But at the same time, I think it did a very good job of raising these questions, because what you have is the first child that was born by the old-fashioned way, the back seat of a car, basically, is the implication they give there. So then the next child, they go to the clinic and they select for intelligence, athletic ability. They can even select for musical ability. They can even determine the sex or the gender of the child, and that is then the sort of new, improved way. And the whole film kind of takes you through, should we be so manipulating children as sort of a consumer product, Or is there some wisdom in, as we talked about with Christy just a few minutes ago and some of the other callers that wanted to get on, do we want to trust God? And should we, as you said, see children as a gift or as a parental plaything? And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, and certainly one of the things that surfaces in the films that you've produced.
Right, and I do encourage all your listeners, I don't know if you're young, you've got to watch Gattaca. I mean, it's a great Uma Thurman, Ethan Hawke film, and when I watched Gattaca when it first came out, it really was science fiction. But Gattaca gives us a good idea of how fast this technology is coming, because if you watch Gattaca today, we're there. I mean, all the things that they talked about in this science fiction movie is happening today, and it's mainstream. It's not even anybody's questioning, should we test for eye color? Should we test for Down syndrome? Should we test for sex? A professor at Stanford Law says that in 50 years, all babies will be made in the laboratory because who's going to want to leave anything to chance?
Wow.
Which is the message of Gattaca. Why leave your children's, creation to chance? I mean, that, of course, ignores God, and God isn't chance. I mean, if we get a child that has a disability or that is, heaven forbid, imperfect, it's not that we left things to chance.
Yeah, I think it's just an illustration of the conflict of worldviews, because if you believe that everything you see around us is a result of chance, then certainly intelligent scientists in the laboratory can drive the engine of evolution. As one wag said, well, we can, with this new technology, rewrite the 5th and 6th days of creation and creating new forms of life. But then you'd also say, well, certainly informed doctors in the laboratory can make sure that we give you the best child, a perfect child, rather than leaving it to chance. And if, again, that's your evolutionary worldview, that's going to lead you that way. But if instead you believe that God is in control and we are living in a fallen world, so certainly we can treat and cure infertility, treat and cure genetic diseases, but still we recognize that we want to understand that we are living in a world that is under God's control. It's a very different kind of worldview. So you have raised some great questions in these films. Just before I let you go, let's again talk about the resources that are available at the Center for Bioethics and Culture Network.
Well, yes, like I said, we have films. You can see a lot of our films. You can watch them online, or you can purchase them if you have a DVD library you want to build out. We have teaching study guide materials that go with each of our films, legislative maps if you want to know what's going on in your particular state, and just a weekly email newsletter. We're very active on Twitter and Facebook, so there's no reason why, if you want information about this topic, you can't find it readily at your fingertips.
Well, Jennifer, I appreciate you taking the time to produce these films. Again, it's a trilogy, in case somebody has just joined us. Exploitation, Anonymous Father's Day, and, of course, the new one is just out, Breeders, a Subclass of Women. And I appreciate you taking the time to not only produce those films and some of the ones you've done in the past, like the great stem cell debate, but I also appreciate you giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's take a break, and when we come back next time, we will get into some other very important issues, and I think that is why I wanted to emphasize once again the importance that I think of you being involved with this financially. Just ask yourself, over the last 2 hours, you've heard things you probably have not heard on other networks. You probably maybe have not even heard them on other Christian radio talk shows. And certainly we want to cover as many topics, trying to provide a biblical perspective on these. And if you value the kinds of conversations that we have here, the opportunity we give to you to talk with some of our guests, including members of Congress and opinion leaders and authors and film producers and others, I hope that you will think about how you might be involved with us. As I mentioned before, the fiscal year ends on June 30th. It is critical that we end this fiscal year with a strong financial backing, and this is a way in which you can help us. We are blessed to have partners that have put together a matching fund, which now is $25,000 in amount. That means that your gift of $100 becomes $200. Your gift of $500 could be $1,000. And so your gift today will be doubled, and we really encourage you to do what you can. You can give online to pointofview.net. Of course, you can also write a check out. Make sure you say matching fund and make it out to Point of View, Post Office Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. All of it available at our website, pointofview.net. I want to thank Andrew and Catherine for their help behind the scenes. See you back here tomorrow.
You have been listening to Point of View. For materials offered on the program, please write to Point of View, Post Office Box 30. That's Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Zip 75221. Or call our toll-free number 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries and is supported by your generous tax-deductible contributions.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.